She emptied our savings account to move to Miami with another man. 2 years later, she was back in my kitchen, holding a coffee she wasn't drinking, asking me to sign one piece of paper so he wouldn't go to federal prison. I keep trying to find a calmer way to start telling you this, and I can't, because that is exactly how it happened. No warning. Just her voice on the phone asking if she could come by, and me saying yes before I'd even decided that I meant it. I should tell you up front, I did not handle any of this the way people expect. There was no yelling, no thrown coffee mug. I wish I could tell you I felt something clean and simple, like triumph, when I finally understood what she needed from me. I didn't. Mostly I just felt tired and a little sad, and underneath that, something that took me weeks to admit was closer to relief. If stories about mature love, betrayal, and the slow, unglamorous kind of justice mean anything to you, stay with me a while. I promise you it gets stranger before it gets better. My name is David. I'm 44. I'm a civil engineer, which mostly means I spend my days reading soil reports and easement language nobody else wants to read. I'm telling you that now because it matters more than you'd think. It's the whole reason any of what follows happened at all. Jessica and I were married for 12 years. For most of them, I would have told you we were happy, though I've had 2 years since then to wonder how much of that was true and how much of it was just quiet. We were good at quiet. I liked routine. She liked possibility. For a long time that balanced out. Then, somewhere I still can't point to exactly, it stopped. It started with flights to Florida. Not many, at first. A work thing, she said. Then a friend's wedding. Then, out of nowhere, a real estate seminar, which should have told me something, because in 12 years Jessica had never shown the slightest interest in real estate. His name was Chase. I want to be fair about him, even now, because turning him into a cartoon doesn't actually explain anything. Chase built luxury condos in Miami. He wore a fleece vest over a dress shirt like it was a uniform. He leased a G-Wagon he could not really afford and talked about vision the way other men talk about weather. None of us knew yet that the money underneath his whole life was borrowed twice over. Jessica told me about him on a Tuesday. Not the affair part, not right away. She told me she wanted a divorce, and she wanted it fast, and she said it standing in our kitchen with her coat still on, like she'd planned it that way, like keeping the coat on meant she could leave the second she'd said it. I asked if there was someone else. She said yes. I remember nodding, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that I was being calm. I was not calm. I just didn't have anywhere to put what I was feeling yet, so it looked like calm from the outside. I didn't fight her on the marriage. People hear that and assume I didn't care. I cared. I just didn't see the use in turning the end of something into a performance for people who'd already made up their minds. What I did fight, or tried to, quietly, was the money. In mediation, she wanted everything liquid. Our savings. Both of our retirement accounts. Every dollar from the house sale. Fast and in cash. It took me longer than it should have to understand why, until her attorney let it slip that the money was meant for a partnership stake in a Miami tower, being built by a man I had never met. I sat there with a coffee going cold in front of me, listening to her ask for almost everything we'd built in 12 years, and thinking I did not know this person. Not the way I thought I had. I didn't fight for the cash in the end. I let her have it. My attorney told me what I was keeping instead wasn't worth arguing over, so I let that go too, easily, the way you let go of something you've already decided is worthless. My pension, and an old family LLC from my grandfather, holding a few mineral rights and land use easements on parcels nobody had thought about in decades. Paper. Dust, basically. Jessica actually laughed when she heard what I was keeping. Keep your dirt, David, she said. I'm going to go build a life. I've turned that sentence over more times than I'd like to admit. Dirt. She left for Miami within the month. I stayed in the same town I'd grown up 20 minutes from, went back to work, and spent a while existing in the shape of a life with all the important parts quietly removed. If you've been left before, you already know what that looks like. I won't dwell on it, except to say that grief for a marriage doesn't look like the movies. It looks like standing in a grocery store trying to remember whether you still buy the coffee she liked or the coffee you actually like, because for 12 years those had become the same decision without you noticing. I met Maria about 4 months into the divorce. She worked at the title company handling the paperwork on the house sale, which means our first real conversation was about deed transfers and closing costs. Possibly the least romantic setting two people have ever met in, and I mean that. She caught an error in the title work that would have cost me nearly $3,000, and instead of quietly fixing it and moving on, she called to explain it to me herself, because she said I deserved to understand what I was signing, not just sign it. I remember thinking that was an odd thing to notice about a stranger, how carefully she explained a mistake that wasn't even hers. I noticed it anyway. Nothing started right away between us. I think that's the truer version of how these things actually happen, whatever the songs say. There was no lightning. There was a woman who returned my calls when she said she would, who somehow remembered I took my coffee black without me telling her twice, and who asked, once, months in, if I was doing okay, in a voice that made it clear she actually wanted the real answer. It took me a long time to let myself want that. I think some part of me was scared that if I reached for something steady too fast, it would turn out to be one more thing I couldn't hold on to. So we built it slowly. A coffee that became a habit. A ride when my car was in the shop that turned into an unofficial Thursday routine neither of us ever named out loud. She left an umbrella in my car once and never asked for it back. I caught myself checking, more than once, that it was still there. By the time Jessica showed up at my door again, Maria and I had been together almost a year and a half. We were saving for a small house of our own, nothing that would photograph well, nothing anyone would post. We had a joke about her terrible taste in true crime podcasts. We had Sunday dinners with her sister that ran long because nobody wanted to be the one to end them. It was, in every way that actually matters, a good life. Quiet. Mine. So when I opened the door that Tuesday and saw Jessica standing there, thinner than I remembered, holding a manila folder against her chest like it might keep her warm, I didn't feel what I expected to feel. Not anger, not really. Something closer to the confusion you feel running into an old coworker in a city you don't live in anymore. She asked for 5 minutes. For old time's sake. I almost said no. I didn't, though, because 12 years isn't nothing, and some habits of politeness outlast whatever used to justify them. She sat down at the table without being asked. Our old table, I suppose, in some version of things. I made coffee out of habit more than hospitality. She didn't drink it. She just held the cup with both hands like she needed somewhere to put them. She told me Chase's project was in trouble. Not a small kind of trouble. The building was mostly finished, but underneath it the money wasn't what it looked like from the street. Overruns. Loans stacked on loans. Accounting decisions, she said carefully, that weren't exactly legal, though he hadn't meant for it to go that far. I didn't say anything. I just waited, the way I used to wait for soil reports to finish printing, knowing the numbers underneath would tell me more than the summary on top. There was a deal on the table, she said. A private equity firm out of New York, ready to bail the whole thing out, clear the fraud exposure before it turned into a formal investigation, and still leave them both with a real profit. Millions, she said, and she said the number like it embarrassed her, which surprised me more than the number did. Then she got to why she was actually there. Their lawyers had found a problem with the title. An easement, tied to the underground parking structure, tied to old land use rights nobody had cleared properly. She said it like an annoyance. A technicality. The kind of thing lawyers argue about that doesn't touch real people. I asked whose rights they were tied to. She looked down at the coffee she wasn't drinking and said my name. Or close enough. She said the LLC's name. My grandfather's LLC. The one she'd called dirt across this same table 2 years earlier. In the rush of the divorce, she said, that one parcel had never been formally released. She needed my signature. Just a signature. She said it twice, like saying it twice might shrink it down to nothing. Then she slid an envelope across the table. $5,000 for my trouble. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I told her I'd need to look everything over properly before I signed anything, which was true, but it was also the first sentence I'd said to her in 2 years that wasn't really about her at all. It was about me, finally, reading the whole thing before agreeing to anything. If you know me, that's the most me sentence I have ever spoken. She left the folder. She left the coffee too, cold on the table by then. She needed an answer by Friday, she said, because after Friday none of it would matter. I sat there a long while after she left, staring at that same cold cup, thinking about the word she'd used. Dirt. That night, I brought the folder to Maria's place instead of sitting with it alone, which 2 years earlier I would not have done. The old version of me would have turned it over privately for days and told her once the decision was already made. I'm not proud of that instinct. I'm telling you about it because choosing differently, this time, turned out to matter more than I expected. Maria read through it at her kitchen table with the kind of quiet concentration I'd learned meant she was actually working, not just being kind to me. She asked good questions. The recording date on the original grant, whether there'd been a formal notice requirement, whether Jessica's attorney had signed off on the transfer during the divorce or simply missed it in the rush. I told her I didn't know. Then let's find out, she said, in a tone with no drama in it at all. Just the plain competence of someone who does this every day and happens to be very good at it. She spent the better part of 2 nights going through old recorded documents most people would find unbearably dull. I sat with her through some of it, not because I understood every page, but because I didn't want her carrying it alone, and because watching her work, patient and unhurried, felt closer to intimacy than most of the more obvious gestures I could think of. Late on the second night, she looked up from a stack of deeds and asked, quietly, if I was doing this to punish Jessica. I didn't answer right away because I didn't have a clean answer. Some part of me, a part I'm not proud of, did want Jessica to finally understand what dirt turned out to be worth. But that wasn't the whole truth, and her question made me sit with the rest of it. I told her, eventually, that I think I just wanted, for once, to not hand something over simply because someone else was in a hurry. She nodded slowly, like that satisfied something in her, and went back to the papers. I noticed, again, that she never once told me what to do. She gave me the truth and let me decide, which is a smaller kind of care than the ones people usually write songs about, but it's the kind that has actually held my life together. What she found, by the second night, was worse than either of us expected. The easement wasn't a minor snag standing between Chase and a clean deal. It was the deal. Without a clear release, the parking structure couldn't be certified, which meant the occupancy permit was at risk, which meant the entire bailout would collapse, which meant Chase's exposure would go from quiet and containable to a formal criminal referral almost overnight. There was more. Records suggesting Chase had been moving investor money between funds for over a year, not cutting one corner, but covering losses again and again, the way you keep telling one lie to protect an earlier one until you've lost track of which lie you're actually protecting. I sat back in my chair when she told me and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly. Clarity. I had no interest in getting loud about any of it. I know there's an expectation, in stories like this, that the wronged man finally gets his moment to shout, to humiliate, to make a scene worth watching. That was never who I was, even furious, and I wasn't going to become someone new just because I finally had leverage. Instead, I called an attorney, not my old one, who told me the LLC was worthless and encouraged me to let Jessica take the cash without a fight. A different one, a sharp, unglamorous man named Whitfield, who read contracts the way I read soil reports, completely, without any interest in being liked while he did it. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he asked what I actually wanted. I told him I wanted to sign the release. I wasn't interested in blocking the deal to be cruel, or watching Chase go to prison in a way that would take Jessica down with him for things that weren't only her fault. What I wanted was for the value of my signature to be recognized honestly, for the first time, instead of assumed worthless and handed over for $5,000. He asked what number I had in mind. I told him the exact figure Jessica had mentioned across my kitchen table, the profit she and Chase stood to make once the bailout closed. Not more. Not some inflated number meant to punish them further than the truth already would. That number, dollar for dollar, as the price of the release. Whitfield looked at me a long moment. He said most people in my position would have asked for double that out of anger, and that he respected that I hadn't. I told him it was never really about doubling anything. It was about the number finally being honest. The days after that were quieter than you'd expect, given what was actually moving underneath them. Whitfield handled the negotiations directly, which meant I didn't have to speak to either of them while the worst of it played out. I went to work. I had dinner with Maria. We kept our Thursday routine, and one night on her porch, 2 cups of tea going cold between us because neither of us wanted to break the conversation to drink them, she asked how I was actually doing. Not the legal part. The rest of it. I told her I felt strange. Not triumphant, the way I might have guessed. Mostly tired, and a little sad in a way I hadn't let myself feel yet. She didn't try to talk me out of the sadness. I noticed that, and I think it's rarer than people realize. She just sat with me, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching, let the tea go cold, and said that made sense, that even losing something you're glad is over still costs you something on the way out. I reached for her hand first that night. Nothing dramatic. It was cold outside and her hand was close to mine on the railing. So I took it, and she let me, and neither of us said anything else about it. We just sat there a while longer before going in. Jessica called twice that week. I let both go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely had nothing useful to say until Whitfield had finished. On the Thursday before the deadline, she showed up again, no call first, which by then had become something of a pattern between us. She looked different, less composed. Whatever performance she'd been carrying since that first visit had mostly worn through, and what was underneath, it was someone actually frightened. She asked what I wanted. Not politely, not with the old bravado either. She asked it like she already suspected the answer would be worse than $5,000. She was right. I told her the number. I watched her face when I said it. And I want to be honest that there was no satisfaction in it, not the kind I might have imagined years earlier. She went pale, then quiet, then asked, in a voice I hadn't heard from her before, if I was doing this to destroy her. I told her no. I told her I was doing it because for 12 years I'd signed whatever was put in front of me, let other people decide what my patience was worth, and that this time, for the first time in my life, I'd actually read the whole document before agreeing to anything. She didn't have an answer for that. She sat there a while, at that same table, and then asked, very quietly, whether keeping the dirt had been worth it after all. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her I'd let her know. The signing happened the next afternoon, in Whitfield's office, with Chase there in person for the first time in this whole story. I'll admit I expected someone larger than the man who walked in. Not physically. There was just less performance left in him than I remembered from photographs. The confidence that used to fill a room now looking like something he was trying hard to remember how to do. He tried a joke when he shook my hand, something about small world, and it landed nowhere, and I watched him understand, in real time, that whatever charm had carried him this far had finally run out of road. I signed a release. It took less time than I expected, given how long it had taken to get there. Whitfield had structured it exactly as I'd asked. The price of the easement set precisely at the profit Chase and Jessica would have kept from the bailout, which meant that once the money came through and cleared the debt, there was nothing left over for either of them. No cushion, just enough to clear the fraud exposure and keep the roof over their heads, and nothing else. Chase avoided federal prison. I want to be honest, because I think stories like this want a villain led away in handcuffs at the end, and that isn't what happened here, and I don't think it needed to happen for this to feel finished. He lost the thing he'd built his entire identity on proving to other people, which, if you'd spent 5 minutes with him, was arguably the harder sentence to serve. Jessica told me weeks later, in a short call that was mostly about some old shared paperwork, that things between her and Chase were struggling. Not just financially. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, that watching it all collapse had exposed how little was actually holding the two of them together underneath everything else. I didn't ask for details, and she didn't offer many. I think we both understood, without saying it out loud, that this was the last real conversation we were ever going to have. I used part of the settlement, once everything closed, to buy a piece of land in the Ohio countryside, 40 minutes outside town, the kind of quiet, unremarkable place Jessica would have found unbearably boring years earlier. There's a slow creek along the eastern edge and enough flat ground for a modest house. Nothing anyone would ever put on a screen, and that was exactly the point. Maria came with me the day we signed for it. The old folder from my grandfather sat on the hood of my truck that afternoon, holding different paperwork now, and she asked if I was sure. Not just about the land. About all of it. Us, building something together after everything that had come before. I told her I was more sure of that than almost anything else in my life, and I meant it plainly, without decoration, the way I actually talk when something finally matters enough to say straight. We signed the new deed together out there, both our names on the same line. Nothing around us but that creek and a long stretch of Ohio sky that didn't need to impress anybody at all. I think about that word sometimes. Dirt. I don't feel angry when I do anymore. I just think about how wrong it's possible to be about what actually holds a life together, and how long it can take to find that out, and how grateful I am that I didn't find out too late to still do something with it. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. I think stories like this matter because most of us have had a moment where someone decided, out loud or just in how they treated us, what our patience was worth. Mine turned out to be worth more than anyone expected, including me. I hope you find out the same thing, whatever version of this you're carrying.